My first day at college was a blur of excitement and nerves. Stepping onto campus felt like the start of something big, something I'd been waiting for. When I finally got to my dorm, I met my roommate. He seemed like a decent guy, friendly, normal, nothing out of the ordinary. That initial awkwardness of meeting someone new quickly faded, and I felt a sense of relief. This was it, the beginning of a new chapter, and everything seemed to be falling into place. That first night in the dorm was more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. I was woken up in the middle of the night by this eerie sound, like a soft murmuring. At first, I couldn't place where it was coming from, but then I realized it was my roommate. He was whispering, but it wasn't clear words, just a low, continuous stream of sound. I tried calling his name, thinking he might be awake, but he didn't respond. He just kept on with those whispers. His eyes shut tight, felt off, like something wasn't right, but I told myself he was just talking in his sleep. After a few minutes of this, I gave up and turned over, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I eventually drifted back to sleep, but that sense of unease stuck with me. The next night, things took a darker turn. I was trying to sleep, but something felt off, like a heavy presence in the room. When I opened my eyes, I saw my roommate standing by the window, just staring out into the darkness. His hand was outstretched, pointing towards the trees in the distance, where there was nothing but shadows. I asked him what he was looking at, but he didn't answer. Instead, he started whispering again, the same strange, incoherent murmurs from the night before, only this time they were more intense, almost frantic. I got out of bed and tried to snap him out of it, but he wouldn't respond. Then, without warning, he turned and walked out of the room, heading straight for that dark spot outside. I just stood there, frozen, completely unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to follow him, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, lying awake, tense and alert until I finally fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, he was back, standing right next to my bed, staring down at me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Over breakfast, I mentioned what happened the previous night. He just stared at me, blankly, as if none of it made any sense. He claimed to remember nothing, not even getting out of bed. I wanted to believe him, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. I tried to go about my day, pushing the thoughts to the back of my mind, but the image of him standing by my bed kept creeping back. The way he looked at me, as if he wasn't really seeing me, sent chills down my spine. I couldn't focus on anything. And by the time evening rolled around, I was dreading the thought of another night in that room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle outside made my heart race. I kept glancing over at him, but he seemed to be sleeping peacefully. Just when I thought I might drift off, I heard it again. Those whispers. This time, they were louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed and saw him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. He was pointing at something in the trees, something I couldn't see. My blood ran cold as I asked him what he was looking at, but all he did was whisper, a stream of words I couldn't understand. He suddenly turned and walked out of the room, heading straight toward the spot he had been pointing at. I wanted to follow him, to stop him, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. I stayed there, lying in bed, my heart pounding, waiting for him to come back. I must have fallen asleep somehow, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and he was standing right next to my bed, watching me. His face was expressionless, his eyes hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. The moment he left for class, I packed my things and requested a transfer. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as I never had to see him again. I never found out what he saw that night or why he whispered those words, but the memory still haunts me, and I'll never forget the terror I felt in that room. I had just graduated from college and was ready to start fresh in the city. Moving into my new apartment felt like the perfect way to kick off this new chapter of my life. The place was small, but cozy, exactly what I needed, and the rent was a steal, a rare find in this city. The landlord was an older guy, nice enough, but a little odd. He mentioned in passing that the current tenant, James, was a bit of a recluse. I didn't really care. I wasn't looking to make friends, just to have a place to call my own. First day in the apartment was all about settling in. I was unpacking boxes, setting up my space, and trying to shake off the nerves that come with being in a new place. The apartment had this old charm to it. Creaky floors, slightly chipped paint, and those big windows that let in just the right amount of sunlight. It felt good, like a place I could really make my own. I didn't meet James right away. The landlord had told me that he worked late hours, so I didn't think much of it when I didn't see him around that first night. I remember sitting in the living room, place quiet except for the distant hum of city noise outside, and feeling this weird mix of excitement and unease. A new beginning always comes with a little bit of both. The next morning, I noticed a few of James' things in the kitchen. An old coffee mug, a half-empty box of cereal on the counter. But no sign of him. It was like living with a ghost. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just one of those people who preferred to keep to themselves. Fine by me. I had enough on my plate with starting a new job soon and getting used to this whole adulting thing. But as the days went by and I still didn't run into James, I started to wonder. The apartment felt oddly quiet for a place with two people living in it. There were no sounds of someone coming home late at night, no footsteps or doors opening and closing, just this strange, almost eerie stillness. Looking back now, I realized that was the first sign that something wasn't quite right. But at the time, I was too caught up in my own life to really pay attention. I had no idea that my new beginning was about to take a dark turn. It wasn't until about a week after I'd moved in that I finally met James. I'd just gotten home from a long day of running errands, juggling the usual chaos that comes with starting a new job. I remember kicking off my shoes by the door and heading straight for the kitchen, my mind already on dinner, when I nearly bumped into him. James was standing by the fridge, staring blankly at its open door, as if he'd forgotten what he was looking for. He was taller than I'd expected, with a lanky frame that made him seem almost gaunt. His eyes were sunken, dark circles etched beneath them, like he hadn't slept in days. When he noticed me, he gave a small nod, barely acknowledging my presence. "Hey," I said, trying to be friendly. "You must be James." Yeah, he cut me off, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. He didn't offer his hand, didn't even seem interested in exchanging pleasantries. He just turned back to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit thrown off. I'd met plenty of shy people before, but James was different. It wasn't just that he was quiet. There was something off about him. Something that put me on edge, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Over the next few days, our paths crossed a handful of times, but the interactions were always the same, brief, awkward, and unsettling. He was like a shadow, always there but never really present. I'd catch glimpses of him coming home late at night, slipping into his room without making a sound. During the day, it was like he didn't exist at all. The apartment was his, but he moved through it like a ghost. One night, I was up late, trying to unwind after a particularly stressful day. I had the TV on low, the only light in the apartment coming from the flickering screen. That's when I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I muted the TV, straining to listen. It was James, I realized, walking up and down the hall. But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost methodical, as if he was pacing with some kind of purpose. I peeked out into the hallway, expecting to see him. There was nothing. Just the dimly lit corridor stretching out in both directions. Pacing stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence that felt even more unnerving. The next morning I mentioned it to him in passing, trying to sound casual. "Hey James, I heard you walking around last night. Everything okay?" He barely glanced at me, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep," he muttered, brushing it off like it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken that hung between us like a heavy fog. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that he was just a weird, introverted guy who preferred to keep to himself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James than he was letting on. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I thought about him. I told myself it was just the stress of the new job, the adjustment to living in a new place. But part of me knew, even then, there was something wrong with James. Something I couldn't explain, but felt in the pit of my stomach every time our paths crossed. Things started to get weird not long after that. At first, it was just little things I could easily brush off as forgetfulness or coincidences. But they added up, and soon, couldn't ignore them anymore. One night, I came home late from work. It had been a long day, and all I wanted to do was crash. As I stepped into the apartment, I immediately noticed something off. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it before leaving, but I figured maybe I hadn't latched it properly in my rush that morning. Still, it felt strange, like a small detail that shouldn't have been out of place. Then, about a week later, it happened again. I walked into the living room and found the light on, even though I distinctly remembered turning it off before leaving. I knew James was supposed to be out of town. He'd mentioned something about a work trip, though it didn't make sense for the light to be on. I checked the apartment just to be sure, but everything else was exactly where it should be. The whole thing left me with an uneasy feeling, like the apartment had a mind of its own. A couple of days after that, I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a sound I couldn't immediately place. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as I lay there in the dark, it grew louder. It was the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate steps pacing back and forth in the hallway just outside my room. I checked the time, 3 a.m. My heart started to race. I listened, holding my breath, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. I finally mustered the courage to get up and check. I moved slowly, quietly, trying not to make a sound as I approached the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see James standing there. But the hallway was empty, just the dim light from the wall sconce casting long shadows on the floor. The footsteps had stopped, leaving nothing but a heavy, unsettling silence. The next morning, I confronted James about it. "Were you up last night? I heard someone walking around," I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He didn't even look up from his phone. "Yeah, that was me. I sometimes walk around when I can't sleep." His response was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of any concern, that it almost made me feel silly for asking. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The way he said it, so nonchalantly, as if it was the most normal thing in the world to be pacing the hallway at 3 a.m., just added to the growing list of things that were making me uneasy. The small, strange occurrences kept happening, each one chipping away at my sense of comfort in the apartment. Lights that should have been off were on, doors that should have been closed were open, and every so often, I'd hear those footsteps again, always at the same time, always in that same deliberate pattern. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just tired, maybe the stress of everything was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something was off, something I couldn't explain, and whatever it was making me more and more anxious. James continued to be distant, barely acknowledging me when we crossed paths. I found myself avoiding him more and more, not wanting to ask questions I didn't want the answers to. The apartment no longer felt like a safe place. Felt like it was watching me, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The strange occurrences continued to escalate, and I felt increasingly on edge in my own home. It was like I was living in a horror movie, and every day brought something new to unnerve me. But nothing could prepare me for the night that changed everything. I had been working late on a project, the glow of my laptop screen the only source of light in my room. I was focused, trying to drown out the creeping anxiety that had become a constant companion, when I suddenly heard it again. The scratching noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound was persistent. A grating sound that seemed to be coming from James's room. It was a low, dragging sound, almost like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself getting out of my chair, heart pounding in my chest. I crept down the hallway, the sound growing louder with each step I took. I felt a mix of dread and determination. I had to know what was going on. I reached James' door and knocked softly. "James? You okay in there?" No response, just that relentless scratching noise. I waited a moment, then slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and the air felt stale and heavy. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a scene that was both chaotic and unsettling. Clothes were strewn everywhere, papers cluttering the floor, and the scratching sound was now unmistakable. It was coming from a closet on the far side of the room. My heart raced as I approached the closet, my mind racing with questions. What was making that sound? I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my stomach, but I had to know. I reached for the handle of the closet door, my hand trembling slightly, and pulled it open. Inside, I found a small, locked chest. The scratching noise was definitely coming from inside it. Frantic now, like something was trying to get out. I hesitated, a wave of panic washing over me. What was in there? My instincts screamed at me to close the door and get out of there, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be in here." I turned to see James standing in the doorway, his face expressionless, eyes dark and unreadable. My heart dropped. I hadn't even heard him come in. I was just checking on you," I stammered, trying to sound casual. I heard a noise. He stepped forward, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. "Vejo qui vous encontró. I see you found it." His words hung in the air, chilling me to the bone. James moved past me and knelt beside the chest, his movements deliberate. He placed his hand on the lid and glanced at me, flicker of something, maybe warning or fear in his eyes. "This is just family stuff. Old things." I watched, frozen, as he opened the chest. Inside, it was a jumbled mess of old photographs, yellowed letters, and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum of the macabre. But what caught my attention was a diary, its pages worn and frayed. James picked it up, flipped through it, expression unreadable. "Look," he said, pointing to a page. "These were my avos, my grandfathers. He had a peculiar obsession with watching people. He wrote about it all the time." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Watching people?" James nodded, his gaze distant as he read the words aloud. He wrote about someone who was always there but never really seen. Someone who watched from the shadows. I felt a mix of horror and disbelief. This was too strange, too unsettling. I wanted to walk away, to forget everything I had just seen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chest. Felt like a dark abyss, a window into something I wasn't prepared to face. As I tried to process everything, James looked up from the chest, his expression shifting. "It's not what you think. It's all in the past," he said, but the way he said it felt like a lie. My instincts screamed that there was more to this story, more than he was letting on. I stepped back, suddenly overwhelmed with dread. The atmosphere in the room had changed, thickening with tension and unspoken truth. Whatever James was hiding, it was becoming clearer that it was much darker than I could have imagined. In the days that followed my unsettling discovery, the atmosphere in the apartment grew even more suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that James was hiding something dangerous. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing with possibilities, each one darker than the last. The strange occurrences had escalated, and every little thing felt like it was connected to James and his family's creepy past. I began finding things moved around. Objects on the counter that I was sure I'd left in a different spot, the bathroom light flickering on and off when no one was home. The unease settled in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing feeling that something was very wrong. One night, I returned home after a long day, hoping to find some peace and quiet. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The apartment was silent, too silent. No TV, no sounds of James moving around. I felt a chill creep over me. I called out, "James, are you here?" But there was no response. I made my way to my room, but before I could reach the door, something caught my eye. There on my bed was a piece of paper. My heart raced as I approached and picked it up. The note read, "I'm going away. Don't try to find me." A wave of panic washed over me. I rushed to James' room, knocking frantically on the door. "James, are you in there?" Silence. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I felt a surge of desperation. I needed answers. Just as I was about to kick the door down, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. My mind raced with fear, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I pounded on the door again, yelling, "James, open up!" Finally, the door creaked open, and there he stood, his expression cold and unreadable. "What is it?" he asked, as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell on my life. "Where are you going?" I demanded, feeling a mix of anger and fear. "What's going on?" He stepped back, and the dim light from the hallway fell across his face, revealing a look of annoyance. "I said not to look for me. You wouldn't understand." "Understand what? What's happening?" I pressed, desperate for some clarity. He shook his head, turning away from me. "Just let it go. You don't want to get involved." But I couldn't just let it go. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and I knew I had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. I backed away, my heart racing. "I'm not going to let this go. There's something wrong with you, with this place." As I turned to leave, James suddenly grabbed my arm. His grip was firm, almost painful, and I looked into his eyes. Something dark flickered within them. "You have to be careful. This place has a history, and it's not friendly." I jerked my arm away, horrified by his warning and the intensity in his voice. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, he stepped back, his expression shifting again. Just forget it." He slammed the door shut, leaving me standing there in shock. I felt an overwhelming need to escape the apartment, to get as far away from James and whatever was happening as I could. But even as I grabbed my things, a sense of dread filled me. What if I wasn't safe anywhere? The next day I moved out. I didn't care about the lease or the trouble it would cause. I just needed to get out. The apartment had become a prison, and James, a haunting presence I couldn't shake. As I packed up my life, I discovered the dark history of the apartment, a series of unexplained disappearances and eerie incidents. I learned that the previous tenants had reported similar strange happenings, and I wondered how many had fallen victim to whatever dark energy lurked within those walls. Even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Sometimes, when I was alone in my new place, I'd hear the faintest scratching sound, a reminder of those haunting nights with James. It was a chilling echo of my time there, a time that left me forever changed. To this day, I still wonder about James. Was he real, or just a figment of the apartment's dark influence? The memory of that locked chest and the secrets it held linger in my mind, a reminder that some places hold more than just walls and windows. They hold stories, and sometimes those stories are best left untold. When Olivia suggested that we finally get our own place, I was beyond excited. We'd both been living with our parents since college, trying to save money, and the idea of finally having our own space felt like the first real step into adulthood. We spent weeks searching for the right apartment, and when we found it, it seemed perfect. Charming, old place in a quiet neighborhood, with just the right amount of character. The rent was reasonable too, which was a huge plus. The apartment had these high ceilings and big windows that let in a lot of light during the day. There was a cozy little kitchen, a spacious living room, and 3 bedrooms. More than enough space for the 2 of us. Everything about it just felt right, like it was meant to be ours. After moving in, we were thrilled with how everything was coming together. Olivia and I spent the first week painting the walls, arranging our furniture, and making the place feel like home. There was something about those old creaky floors and the way the light filtered through the windows in the late afternoon that made it all feel so peaceful. Then, we decided to take on a 3rd roommate to help with the rent. That's when Liam came into the picture. We met him through a mutual friend, and he seemed like a great fit. Friendly, easygoing, a stable job that reassured us we wouldn't have any issues when it came to splitting the bill. He moved in with his things a few days after we signed the lease, and we all settled into our new routines. At first, everything was fine. Liam was polite and kept to himself most of the time. He wasn't around much during the day, and when he was home, he mostly stayed in his room. Olivia and I didn't mind. It was actually kind of nice having someone around who wasn't too intrusive. We had a few casual conversations here and there, but Liam always seemed to retreat to his room pretty quickly after a chat. We figured he was just the quiet type, maybe a bit introverted. But looking back now, I realized that was when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything major at first, just little things that I shrugged off. But that initial excitement about the apartment, about living with friends, began to fade just a bit. I tried to ignore it though. After all, we'd just moved in. It was probably just the adjustment period, right? I had no idea what was coming. It wasn't long after Liam moved in that I started noticing strange noises coming from his room. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living in an old apartment meant creaky floors and weird sounds were part of the deal. But this was different. I'd be sitting in the living room or in the kitchen making dinner, and I'd hear muffled voices coming from behind his door, like he was talking to someone. But every time I stopped what I was doing to listen more closely, the voices would suddenly stop. It was weird, but I figured he was just on the phone or watching something late at night. Then, one night, Olivia and I went out to see a movie. We got home pretty late, laughing and chatting as we walked up the stairs to our apartment. When we reached the door, we both stopped short. The door was slightly open. I remember the way my stomach dropped when I saw it. I was sure we'd locked it when we left. We always locked it. We exchanged a look, the kind that says, "Did you leave it open?" But neither of us had. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find someone inside, but the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. There was nothing out of place, no sign of a break-in or anything like that. Liam's door was closed as usual, and the whole place was eerily still. We walked through each room, checking to make sure nothing was missing or disturbed. Everything seemed fine. The whole situation felt wrong. I knocked on Liam's door, just to see if he was awake. There was no answer. Crossed my mind to mention it to him the next day, but something held me back. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid, or maybe it was just late, and I wanted to forget about it. Olivia and I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on one of us being forgetful. That uneasy feeling stuck with me. From then on, every time I walked through the door, I'd double-check that it was locked behind me. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. Over the next few weeks, that feeling grew stronger. Little things started happening around the apartment, things that didn't make sense. I'd find kitchen utensils in the living room, or my books would be moved around on the shelf. I thought maybe Olivia was reorganizing things, but when I asked her, she looked just as puzzled as I was. She'd noticed similar things too. Clothes moved around in her closet, her shoes lined up differently than she'd left them. First, it seemed like maybe we were just being careless, but it kept happening. And that feeling of being watched, of something just slightly out of place, became impossible to ignore. It was as if the apartment itself was starting to turn against us. But again, I tried to brush it off. After all, what else could I do? I didn't want to seem crazy, and there was no way I was going to let some weird noises and misplaced objects scare me out of our new place. But late at night, when the apartment was dark and quiet, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more going on, if Liam or something else entirely was behind it. As the weeks passed, the weirdness in the apartment only got worse. It wasn't just the small things anymore. The feeling that something was off became almost unbearable. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, especially when I was alone. I'd sit in the living room trying to focus on a book or a show, but I'd keep glancing up at the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. I'd hear the slightest creak of the floorboards, and my heart would skip a beat. One night, Olivia was out late with friends, so I had the apartment to myself. I figured I'd use the time to catch up on some work, so I spread out my laptop and notes on the coffee table and got to it. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to ignore the unsettling silence by turning on some music. It didn't help. Every sound seemed amplified. Every creak of the building settling felt like a warning. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from Liam's room. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like something was being dragged across the floor. At first, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just Liam moving something around, or maybe his chair scraping the floor. But the sound continued, growing louder and more frantic. My curiosity got the better of me. I hesitated, listening closely, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing in there. The scratching turned into something more like a scraping noise, almost like nails on a chalkboard, and it sent chills down my spine. Couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I stood up and slowly made my way down the hall toward Liam's room. Closer I got, the more intense the sound became. My heart was pounding, and every instinct told me to turn back, but I kept going. I reached his door and paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knocked lightly, hoping he'd answer and put my mind at ease. There was no response. After a moment, I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. The scratching continued, and now it was accompanied by a faint, muttering voice. Liam's voice. He was talking to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I tried to convince myself that he was just working on something, maybe a project for his job, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I took a deep breath and turned the knob, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was dimly lit, only light coming from a small lamp on his desk. Liam was sitting there, hunched over something, his back to me. The scratching was coming from his desk, where he was furiously scribbling in a notebook. His movements were erratic, almost frantic, and the sound of the pen scratching against the paper was unnerving. "Liam?" I called softly, hoping to get his attention without startling him. But he didn't respond. He just kept writing, his hand moving faster and faster, the muttering growing louder. I could barely make out the words, but they sounded disjointed, like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see. Finally, he must have sensed me standing there because he stopped abruptly, slamming the notebook shut and whipping around to face me. His eyes were wild, his expression a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice low and tense. I stumbled over my words, feeling suddenly foolish. I heard a noise and just wanted to check if you were okay." His face softened slightly, but the tension didn't leave his eyes. "I'm fine," he said, almost too quickly, "just working on something. Sorry if I disturbed you." I nodded, backing away, feeling more unsettled than ever. "No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure." He gave me a forced smile, but there was something behind it, something that made me feel like I'd crossed a line. "Thanks, but I'm good. You should get some sleep." I didn't argue. I practically fled back to the living room, my heart racing. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself that Liam was just having a rough night, that maybe dealing with stress. But I couldn't forget the look in his eyes or the way he was talking to himself. Something was seriously wrong, and I was starting to realize that whatever it was, it went far beyond a few strange noises. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept replaying the scene in Liam's room over and over in my head. There was something he wasn't telling us, something he was hiding, and I had a horrible feeling that whatever it was, we were in way over our heads. The morning after my unsettling encounter with Liam, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Olivia and I went about our routine, but I could tell she felt it too. There was a tension in the air that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We didn't talk much about what had been happening. Maybe we were both trying to avoid facing it head on. But that uneasy silence only made things worse. That weekend, we decided to tackle some cleaning. The apartment was old and dusty, and it felt like a good way to distract ourselves. We started with the common areas, dusting, vacuuming, the usual stuff. But as we moved through the apartment, I could see the discomfort growing in Olivia's eyes. It was like we were both waiting for something to happen, some final shoe to drop. Eventually, we made our way up to the attic. We hadn't really explored it since moving in, mainly because it was dark, cramped, and filled with forgotten junk left by previous tenants. But we figured it was time to clear out some space and get rid of anything we didn't need. As we started moving boxes and old furniture around, Olivia and I fell into an uneasy rhythm. I was about to suggest we call it a day when Olivia stopped in her tracks, staring at something in the corner. I followed her gaze and saw it too, a dusty old box hidden behind a stack of broken chairs. It was small, unassuming, but something about it gave me the creeps. "Should we open it?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Curiosity got the better of me. "Yeah, let's see what's inside." We carefully dragged the box into the middle of the attic, both of us kneeling in front of it like kids about to unwrap a present. The cardboard was brittle, and the tape holding it together practically disintegrated as I pulled it off. Inside, we found a haphazard collection of items, old photographs, letters, and random knickknacks. It looked like someone's personal stash of memories, long forgotten. Olivia picked up one of the photos, her brow furrowing. These people, they look familiar. I took the picture from her and felt a cold chill run down my spine. Photo was black and white, taken decades ago, but the faces were unmistakable. A group of people standing together in front of what looked like a house. The expressions on their faces were strange, blank, almost hollow. And there, standing off to the side, was someone who looked eerily like Liam. The resemblance was uncanny, right down to the way he stood, slightly apart from the others. I turned the photo over and saw a handwritten note on the back. The third roommate always leaves. My heart started to race. I could see the same fear mirrored in Olivia's eyes. "This can't be real," she muttered, but even as she said it, I could tell she didn't believe it. Neither did I. We continued digging through the box, finding more photos, each one more unsettling than the last. Different groups of people, all posed similarly, with that same lifeless look in their eyes. And in every photo, there was someone who looked like Liam, or at least someone related to him. The dates on the back of the photos spanned decades, yet the faces barely changed. Among the photos, we found letters, notes scribbled in hurried, panicked handwriting. They talked about strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances, and the same unsettling feeling that we had been experiencing. But the most disturbing part was the repeated mention of a curse, something about the apartment and the third roommate. No one stayed for long, and those who did either vanished or went mad. Olivia and I stared at each other, the reality of our situation sinking in. This wasn't just a string of coincidences or a series of weird events. Something was seriously wrong with this apartment, and Liam was at the center of it. "We have to talk to him," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "We have to find out what's going on." I nodded, but dread settled in my stomach. I didn't know if I could face Liam again, not after what I'd seen the night before. But we couldn't ignore this. We couldn't just pretend that everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. That night, Olivia and I waited for Liam to come home. The atmosphere in the apartment was suffocating, the silence thick with unspoken fear. When we heard the front door creak open, our hearts skipped a beat. We exchanged a glance, then slowly walked down the hallway to confront him. Liam was standing in the entryway, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked different, or withdrawn, almost like he'd aged overnight. When he saw us, his expression hardened, as if he knew exactly what we were going to say. "We found something," Olivia began, holding up one of the photos. Liam's eyes flicked to the photo, and for a moment his face twisted into something dark, something I'd never seen before. Then, just as quickly, he forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Those are just old family photos," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Nothing to worry about." We weren't buying it. The fear in Olivia's eyes was clear, and I could feel my own pulse quicken as I stepped forward. "Liam, what the hell is going on? Who are you?" He stared at us for a long moment, his smile fading. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone up there. You shouldn't have found those." Before we could react, he turned and walked down the hallway to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the apartment, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. Something was very wrong, and we had just made it worse. After that confrontation, things escalated quickly. Liam's behavior became more erratic, and the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. Olivia and I barely slept, too on edge to relax, too scared to close our eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows sent us into a state of high alert. We knew something was coming, but we had no idea when or how it would happen. One night, about a week after we found the box in the attic, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my mind still foggy from the little sleep I had managed to get. I strained to listen, my ears picking up on the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 3 a.m. The witching hour. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if the footsteps were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Everything felt distorted in the darkness. like the shadows were stretching and shifting with each step I took. The air was thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. As I stepped into the hallway, I could see a faint light coming from under Liam's door. The footsteps stopped, and the apartment fell into an eerie silence. I tiptoed closer, each step agonizingly slow, trying to keep my breathing quiet. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. What I heard made my blood run cold. A low, guttural voice was speaking, but it wasn't Liam's. It was deep, almost inhuman, and the words were a jumbled mix of languages I couldn't understand. It sounded like a chant, rhythmic and dark, punctuated by the occasional thud as if something heavy was being moved across the floor. I stumbled back from the door, fear gripping me. I had to get Olivia. We needed to get out of here, right now. I turned to run to Olivia's room, but as I did, I saw her standing in the hallway, eyes wide with terror. She had heard it too. We didn't need to speak. The look on her face told me everything. We both knew this was our last chance. Without a word, we rushed back to our rooms to grab whatever we could. I stuffed my essentials into a bag, hands shaking so badly that I could barely zip it up. The chanting continued in the background, growing louder, more frantic. The whole apartment felt like it was vibrating with the sound, like it was alive, pulsing with some dark energy that we had unknowingly unleashed. I met Olivia at the front door, and we bolted out of the apartment without looking back. The moment we stepped outside, the night air hit us like a cold splash of water, but it did nothing to calm our nerves. We sprinted down the stairs, out of the building, and onto the empty street. We didn't stop running until we were a few blocks away, the apartment looming behind us like a shadow we couldn't escape. Finally, out of breath and trembling, we stopped at a small park and collapsed onto a bench. The silence outside was deafening compared to the chaos we had just escaped. I glanced at Olivia, who was shaking, tears streaming down her face. I didn't realize I was crying too until I felt the wetness on my cheeks. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But we're not going back." We sat there in the cold, too scared to move, too scared to think. The events of the past few weeks crashed over us like a wave, and I felt like I was drowning in fear and confusion. Liam was gone, disappeared into whatever darkness he had brought into that apartment. We never saw him again, and honestly, I never wanted to. We called the landlord the next morning and told him everything. He didn't believe us, of course. He chalked it up to stress, overactive imaginations, anything but the truth. But I didn't care. We packed up our things that same day and left that cursed apartment behind, never looking back. Weeks later, after we had settled into a new place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, something I couldn't see but could feel watching, waiting. I started having nightmares, visions of Liam or whatever he had become, standing at the foot of my bed, staring with those hollow, lifeless eyes. The sound of that guttural chanting echoed in my mind every night, and no matter how much I tried to forget, clung to me like a shadow. Olivia and I don't talk much about what happened anymore. It's like a bad dream we're both trying to forget. But every so often, I catch her looking over her shoulder or checking the locks one too many times. And I know she feels it too. We escaped that apartment, but whatever darkness was in there, I'm not sure it ever really let us go. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet and still, I think I can hear that faint sound again. The rhythmic scratching, like something dragging itself across the floor, coming from just outside my door.